He was the man who unlocked the secrets of the cosmos, the gentle-faced genius, whose name is synonymous with humanity's highest intellect. Albert Einstein gave us the universe, but the devastating untold story is that he was a failed father whose own children were collateral damage. One lost to history, one scarred by neglect, and one left to die in an asylum. So what truly became of the three heirs to the Einstein legacy the children sacrificed at the altar of his monumental genius? Welcome. You clicked on this video because you know the physicist who reshaped our reality, but you sense the real human drama lies hidden in the family he left behind. In this exhaustive deep dive documentary, we will tell the complete multi-generational and largely untold story of all three of Albert Einstein's children, from his first marriage to Mileva Marić. We will begin with the greatest mystery of his life, the secret illegitimate daughter Lieserl, who was born before his fame and vanished from history. We will then explore the complex and defiant life of his firstborn son, Hans Albert Einstein, the engineer who escaped his father's shadow to become a legend in his own right. And finally, we will uncover the heartbreaking tragedy of his youngest son, Eduard Tete Einstein, the brilliant, sensitive child who succumbed to mental illness and was abandoned by his father. To bring you this incredible, poignant saga, we have gone far beyond the physics textbooks and the familiar quotes about imagination. We have meticulously researched the deeply personal and often painful letters between Einstein and Mileva Marić, discovered only in 1987. We have analyzed numerous scholarly biographies, including those by Walter Isaacson, and pieced together the psychological drama of a family fractured by fame, genius, infidelity, and immense unspoken sorrow. This is not just a superficial, "Where are they now?" It is a deep, unflinching exploration of the profound human cost of being the child of a titan. Prepare to understand the full, complex, and deeply human story behind the Einstein heirs. Number 3. The Lost Daughter. The Mystery of Lieserl. Einstein. The story of the Einstein children begins not with a celebration, but with a secret. A child born in the shadows, conceived out of wedlock, whose very existence was so thoroughly erased from the public record that the world didn't even know she existed for over 80 years. This is the story of the ghost in the Einstein legacy. The story of Lieserl Einstein is first and foremost the story of the passionate intellectual and ultimately tragic romance between Albert Einstein and Mileva Marić. They met in 1896 at the prestigious Zurich Polytechnic, now ETH Zurich. They were the only two students in their section of the physics and mathematics program. He was a charismatic, rebellious 17-year-old German. She was a brilliant, serious 20-year-old Serbian woman with a slight limp from a congenital hip condition who had fought incredible odds just to be there, one of the first women to pursue such a degree. They were intellectual equals, fellow creatures, as Albert called her. They fell deeply in love, their letters filled with shared physics problems and passionate declarations. This idyllic academic partnership was shattered in 1901. Mileva, having failed her final exams, perhaps distracted by her relationship and pregnancy, discovered she was pregnant. In the rigid bourgeois society of turn-of-the-century Europe, an illegitimate child was not just a scandal, it was a catastrophe. For Einstein, who was 22, still without a job, he hadn't yet secured the famous patent office position, and whose parents, particularly his mother Pauline, virulently opposed his relationship with Mileva. The news was a professional and personal disaster. For Mileva, it was even worse. Her academic career, her life's dream, was over. In late 1901, a pregnant and disgraced Mileva traveled back to her family's home in Novi Sad, Serbia, to give birth in secret while Albert remained in Switzerland, desperately trying to find work. In January 1902, their daughter was born. We only know her as Lieserl, the diminutive placeholder name they used in their letters. Albert, who was in Bern, never saw his daughter. Their correspondence from this period is fraught with anxiety. He writes about the consequences and his parents' horror, but also expresses concern. Is she healthy? And does she already cry properly? What kind of little eyes does she have? Whom of us does she resemble more? And then, silence. After a final mention in a letter from Albert in September 1903, in which he expresses concern because the child has contracted scarlet fever, Lieserl Einstein vanishes completely from history. Her name is never mentioned again. No birth certificate has ever been found. No gravesite is known. Her fate remains the greatest mystery of Einstein's personal life. This brings us to the scandal and the theories. What happened to Lieserl 1, the tragedy theory? The most straightforward and perhaps most heartbreaking explanation is that she died. The last letter mentions she has scarlet fever. In 1903, before antibiotics, scarlet fever was a terrifying and often fatal childhood disease. It's highly probable the infant, perhaps already weakened, did not survive. This would make her a hidden tragic loss, a secret sorrow buried at the very foundation of Albert and Mileva's marriage. They finally married in January 1903, after Albert's father died and gave his blessing on his deathbed. 2. The adoption theory. This is the more complex and more widely debated theory. To save their careers and their chance at a respectable life together, did Albert and Mileva give their daughter up for adoption? It's possible she was quietly adopted, perhaps by Mileva's close friend Helene Savage, or by another local family. This theory suggests a deliberate, painful sacrifice, the price they paid for their future. Historians and biographers have searched for decades, but no definitive Lieserl has ever been found. The untold story of Lieserl is not just about her fate, but about the impact of her existence. This secret, this tragedy, this impossible choice was the foundational wound of the Einstein-Maric marriage. It cast a long, dark shadow. Did the guilt and grief of this lost child poison their relationship from the start? Did it contribute to Mileva's later depression and melancholy? Did it shape Albert's own complex, often detached approach to fatherhood? With his next 2 children, Lieserl is the ghost in the machine. Her existence was only revealed in 1987, when the cache of early letters between Albert and Mileva was discovered. Her story fundamentally reframes our understanding of Einstein the man. It introduces a note of profound human tragedy and moral complexity, right at the beginning of his Annus Mirabilis miracle year of 1905. The man who was about to reshape our understanding of the universe began his journey by grappling with a deeply personal, hidden secret. Lieserl was the tragic secret, a child erased by history and circumstance. The next child, their first son, would be born into the marriage, a child of the miracle year itself. He would grow up in his father's presence, but would live his entire life fighting a different battle. A desperate struggle for the attention, respect, and emotional connection of a father who was physically present, but emotionally absent, a genius whose mind was always elsewhere. Number 2. The son who escaped the shadow, Hans Albert Einstein. The first son born during the miracle year that would make his father immortal. He grew up in the direct presence of genius as it unfolded. But his childhood would be defined not by shared discovery, but by cold, growing distance, the bitter collapse of his family, and a lifelong defiant quest to prove that he could be a success on his own terms. Not in the abstract cosmos, but in the practical, gritty world of mud, silt, and water. Born on May 14, 1904, in Bern, Switzerland, Hans Albert Einstein arrived just as his father was working as a clerk in the Swiss patent office. His early childhood was on the surface idyllic. He was a bright, curious boy. 1905, when Hans Albert was just a year old, was his father's Annus Mirabilis, the miracle year when Einstein published 4 revolutionary papers on the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, special relativity, and the equivalence of mass and energy, EXMC2. Hans Albert grew up in Bern and later Zurich, literally watching his father reshape physics, his home filled with visiting academics and intense discussions. But this intellectual paradise was an emotional wasteland. Albert's relationship with Mileva, already strained by the lost Lieserl and the pressures of their different temperaments, began to completely disintegrate as his fame grew. He was offered a prestigious professorship in Berlin in 1914. He accepted, but he went alone. He had already begun an affair with his cousin Else Löwenthal, whom he would later marry. He effectively abandoned his family, leaving Mileva, 10-year-old Hans Albert and 4-year-old Eduard behind in Zurich. This abandonment was the central trauma of Hans Albert's life. He at 10 suddenly became the man of the house, supporting his grieving, increasingly depressed mother. He saw firsthand the devastating emotional and financial toll the separation took on her. His father's divorce conditions, which were eventually agreed upon, were infamously cold and controlling, including a clause that Mileva must stop talking to me if I request it. Hans Albert developed a deep, lasting resentment towards his father for this perceived betrayal of his mother and brother. This resentment fueled his rebellion. As a young man, he showed great aptitude for science and math. But he deliberately chose a different path from his father. While Albert, the theoretical physicist, urged him to pursue pure science, Hans Albert chose engineering, a practical, tangible, dirty hands profession. He enrolled at ETH Zurich, his parents' alma mater, and specialized in civil engineering. His chosen field became his ultimate brilliant act of defiance. He became a world-renowned expert in sediment transport, the study of how silt and mud move in rivers. While his father's head was in the cosmos, Hans Albert firmly planted his feet in the mud. Their relationship was fraught with conflict. Albert was relentlessly critical. He opposed Hans Albert's choice of career. He vehemently opposed his son's choice of wife, Frieda Knecht, a woman several years older than him, just as Mileva had been older than Albert, whom Einstein cruelly dismissed as a dwarf. This mirrored the exact same prejudice his own mother, Pauline, had shown towards Mileva. Despite his father's protests, Hans Albert married Frieda in 1927. Hans Albert earned his doctorate in technical sciences in 1936. In 1938, seeing the rise of Nazism in Germany, and perhaps still seeking distance from his father, who had already fled to Princeton, New Jersey, Hans Albert emigrated with his family to the United States, settling in South Carolina and eventually, in 1947, in California. He became a professor of hydraulic engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, a position he held for the rest of his life. He became the preeminent authority in his field. His work on sediment transport was foundational, and he consulted on major water projects across the country, including the Missouri River. He achieved on his own terms a level of success and respect that was entirely separate from his father's. He had escaped the shadow. Their personal relationship remained a complex, often painful, armed truce. They would visit each other in Princeton or California. But the old wounds, particularly regarding Albert's treatment of Mileva, never fully healed. Hans Albert also endured his own profound tragedies. His first son, Bernhard, became a physicist, perhaps a bridge between the two, but his second son, Klaus, died of diphtheria as a child. He later adopted a daughter, Evelyn, whose own parentage would later become a subject of mystery and speculation. After his first wife, Frieda, died in 1958, he remarried. Hans Albert Einstein died of heart failure in 1973. His scandal was his lifelong quiet war with his father. The untold story is his profound success in spite of his father. He navigated the crushing expectation of being Einstein's son by choosing a field that was both scientifically rigorous and deeply practical, a world his father couldn't critique or control. He built the stable family life and the respected, grounded career his father never did. Hans Albert escaped the shadow by building a rigid, practical, and successful life in America in defiant opposition to his father. But the youngest son left behind in Zurich with his grieving mother would not be so fortunate. He would inherit not just his father's genius, but his mother's tragedy. His life a devastating descent into the one realm his father's intellect could never penetrate, the darkness of the human mind. Number 1. The son who was lost, the tragedy of Eduard Tete Einstein. The youngest, the Tete, a pet name from his father. He was the sensitive, brilliant, artistic child who adored music and the human mind. He seemed poised to inherit the genius, but instead he inherited a devastating illness that would trap him in an asylum abandoned by his father for the rest of his life, becoming the Einstein family's deepest, most profound tragedy. Born on July 28, 1910 in Zurich, Switzerland, Eduard Einstein, known as Tete, was the second son and third child of Albert and Mileva. He was born just as his father's career was solidifying a period of relative stability before the Berlin move. He was by all accounts an exceptionally bright and sensitive child, possessing a quick wit, a love for poetry, and a profound talent for music, particularly the piano. He also showed a deep interest in human psychology. He seemed to be the perfect blend of his parents' intellectual and artistic sensibilities. But the central trauma of his life occurred when he was just 4 years old. In 1914, his father moved to Berlin, leaving Eduard, his brother Hans Albert, then 10, and his mother Mileva behind. While Hans Albert had 10 years to form a bond, however fraught with his father, Eduard's primary formative memory of his father was one of absence. He grew up in a household dominated by his mother, a woman who was reportedly descending into depression and bitterness, mourning her lost career and her failed marriage. Eduard, the sensitive child, became her primary emotional confidant, absorbing her sadness. He idealized the absent father he barely knew, writing him poetry and letters, longing for a connection that was mostly filtered through correspondence. As a young man, Eduard was brilliant. He excelled in his studies, and following his interest in the human mind, he enrolled in university to study medicine with the specific goal of becoming a psychiatrist. He was fascinated by Freud and the new emerging world of psychoanalysis. It seemed he was on a path to greatness, perhaps to unlock the mysteries of the mind, just as his father had unlocked the mysteries of the cosmos. But in 1930, around the age of 20, Eduard suffered a severe mental breakdown. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia. This diagnosis was the scandal and the tragedy. In the 1930s, schizophrenia was a poorly understood, deeply stigmatized condition, often seen as a life sentence. The treatments were primitive and often brutal, ranging from institutionalization to severe experimental interventions like insulin coma therapy and electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, which Eduard was subjected to, and which many believe worsened his condition, possibly causing brain damage. Albert Einstein, then still in Germany, but preparing to flee the rise of Nazism, was devastated. He reportedly, and perhaps unfairly, blamed Mileva's family lineage for the illness, as her sister had also suffered from mental health issues. He visited Eduard a few times in the Burgholzli psychiatric clinic in Zurich, a world-famous institution, but the encounters were reportedly painful and strained. In 1933, Albert Einstein emigrated to the United States for good. He settled in Princeton, New Jersey, and became the world's most famous refugee, a global humanitarian icon. In doing so, he made a decision that is impossible to reconcile with his public image. He left his sick son behind. After 1933, Albert Einstein never saw his son Eduard again. For the next 32 years, Eduard Einstein's life was a living tragedy. He spent the rest of his existence as a permanent resident of the Burgholzli asylum. His mother Mileva cared for him heroically, visiting him, fighting for him, and managing his care until her own death in 1948. She exhausted her finances, including the Nobel Prize money Albert had given her, as part of their divorce settlement in the process. After Mileva's death, Eduard was left alone, a ward of the state, his condition deteriorating. This is the central heartbreaking contradiction of Albert Einstein's life. He was a man who could write passionate letters to world leaders, who could advocate for civil rights, who could plead for global peace and humanity. But he could not or would not cross the ocean to visit his institutionalized schizophrenic son. He continued to send money for his care and wrote occasional, perhaps detached letters. But the physical and emotional abandonment was total. He reportedly feared that a visit would be too painful or that his presence would agitate his son. Eduard Tete Einstein died in the Burgholzli asylum in 1965 at the age of 55 from a stroke. He had outlived his famous father by a decade, but had spent more than half his life locked away. The untold story of Eduard Einstein is the family's darkest secret. It is the story of a brilliant mind destroyed by illness and abandoned by the father he adored. His life is the ultimate profound tragedy of the Einstein legacy. A story of a human mind his father's physics could not explain, and his father's humanity, it seems, could not save. The three fates of the Einstein children, one lost, one escaped, one abandoned, paint a powerful and heartbreaking portrait of the immense human cost hidden behind the myth of a 20th century genius. Their story forces us to reconcile the image of the humanitarian icon with the reality of the flawed and perhaps failed father. This theme of a towering scientific mind and the family that lived in its unique complex shadow resonates deeply with the story of another titan of physics. That man was, of course, Stephen Hawking. On this channel previously, we explored the fascinating and often poignant story of Stephen Hawking's three children. Did you know that the children of the man whose mind roamed the cosmos, while his body was trapped in a chair, navigated their own complex world of caregiving fame and the search for identity, living with a father who was both a global icon and an intimate, demanding presence? The full, untold story of the Hawking children is one you won't want to miss. Click the video on your screen right now to uncover that incredible, untold story. And as always, thank you for watching.